The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Lewis with Smart Training, and thank you for joining us for our 2013 year-end compliance review. Certainly, we've had no shortage of regulatory compliance issues in the area of HIPAA, OSHA, and of course GHS, Global Harmonized System, took effect on December 1st. We have gone over a number of these programs in prior webinars. Today's purpose of today's webinar is to go ahead and review some of those compliance issues and also talk about what's coming up in the year ahead, 2014, with GHS and other OSHA issues. Jim Moore, nationally certified compliance specialist, will be our presenter today, along with Lee Slayton. And of course, I'd like to thank all of our clients for attending, from the Texas Dental Association and our newest client, the Oklahoma Dental Association, and its members for attending today. And hopefully you will all glean something that will be useful for keeping you compliant throughout the coming year. Jim, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Well, Larry, you're entirely correct. 2013 was certainly a watershed event with respect to regulatory compliance, and in the first half of our time together today, we're going to talk about what happened during the year, the specific changes that took place relative to OSHA, HIPAA, House Bill 300 in Texas, and of course HITECH and the Omnibus Rule. And then on the back half, a bit of a Christmas present from all of us at Smart Training. We'll tell you what you can look out for, what you can expect in 2014 as the compliance efforts for HIPAA and OSHA begin to come full circle. What we saw during 2013 in many respects was a ground-laying effort for HIPAA and HITECH compliance. In 2014 in particular, we'll begin to see those come to fruition, and we'll also have some good insight for you on what OSHA is paying attention to during the coming year. So if you want to take a quick look around your office and make sure that you're compliant in those very specific areas, we'll be giving you that information late in our webinar. And we'll also have Lee Slayton joining us, and Lee will provide some insight on his on-site inspections. We've got a lot to cover today. We mentioned, of course, the Omnibus Rule, which is not new rulemaking, but it was certainly a new step for most practices across the United States, and particularly in our part of the country. House Bill 300, as amended by Senate Bill 1609, is of great interest to all Texas-based healthcare entities. The OSHA adoption of GHS will affect a good many dental practices and obviously workplaces as well. And again, we'll talk about what OSHA will be looking for specifically in the year ahead, and what the Office of the Inspector General and KPMG as the HIPAA auditor will be looking for in 2014 as well. So that's what we've got on our plate. We've got a fair bit to cover, and let's begin with a summary of the Omnibus Rule. The Omnibus Rule, of course, came into effect back in September, and it really brought forth the final modifications that were issued during 2010. So there's no new rulemaking in the Omnibus Rule, and I repeated this again and again to clients who were concerned or upset that they might have missed something. My point was this: if you indeed had missed the information or the requirements of the Omnibus Rule, you've been missing it now for 3 years because there wasn't any new rulemaking involved. It was all old law that was now a required compliance activity for practices effective September 26th. So the business associate, this is the real key to understanding the Omnibus Rule. The business associates around the United States, entities that do business with covered entities who exchange PHI with these folks, are now directly liable for their own HIPAA compliance. That's the real bone in the Omnibus Rule. It also prohibits any sort of sale or marketing of patient health information. It expands the patient's right to obtain an electronic copy of their health records. So, of course, if your practice is not an EHR practice, then you probably aren't too awfully concerned about that, but a great many are. And particularly with the incentives offered by the government to become EHR compliant, that little bullet point, the fourth on your screen, has some merit. The Omnibus Rule really focused on giving patients a right to copies of their EHR, and consequently it required you to modify your notice of privacy practices as well. That was all part and parcel of the omnibus rule that was effective September 23rd. I think I said the 26th a moment ago. The actual omnibus rule became effective on the 26th of March 2013. Covered entities were compliant 180 days later, which I think worked out to the 23rd of September. And of course, at Smart Training, we got a lot of calls on the 21st, 22nd from covered entities who were concerned about their compliance status. But again, none of this was new rulemaking. None of this was new law. You should have been compliant with every part and parcel of the omnibus rule for the last 2 or 3 years. Also, in the omnibus rule, as you see on the screen, effectively it required practices to adopt additional high-tech enhancements to ensure the safety and the security of electronic patient data. There is the new civil money penalty structure that is now law. The breach notification harm threshold has been very clearly defined so that you know now when a data breach is actually going to cause harm and when it may not. There's also the prohibition on the disclosure of genetic information. And those are all elements of the omnibus rule that, again, took effect back in September. But if you're a covered entity from a healthcare perspective in the HIPAA and high-tech spectrum of the land, this was the most important event in 2013. And obviously, a great many of us were paying very close attention to what was coming down the pike. The point that I want to stress, though, and I think this is the third time I've said it, is that there's nothing new in the omnibus rule. That's easy enough to say. It is sometimes hard to help practice administrators and managers and rank-and-file employees really understand. The omnibus rule was a finalization of the Health and Human Services interim final rules that were passed in 2010. So effectively, it was 3.5-year-old law at the time you were required to adopt it. Compliance as an issue has been covered in other webinars that we've done during the course of 2013. It does, of course, require you to have some basic familiarity with HIPAA and high-tech. But here's the key, that bottom bullet point where it says step up to broader enforcement. That was the real meaning, that was the real meat behind the omnibus rule. It gave the authorities the opportunity to move up from HIPAA being merely a threat or something to wave in the face of covered entities like you, and all of a sudden say, now we're going to enforce it, and if you don't pay attention, if you don't make sure that your practice is compliant, we're going to fine you up to the point of extinction. That bullet point is the criticality with respect to the omnibus rule. And if you don't understand that basically what the government has done here is to shut the door on your get-out-of-jail-free card, take that away from you effectively with the adoption of the omnibus rule, you really miss the impact of this rulemaking altogether, because it effectively closes the door forever on the laissez-faire days of compliance. I have clients tell me all the time, oh, I'm not particularly concerned about our PHI security or our compliance with that. Well, this little bullet point means you need to be, because now the government has the opportunity, the authority, and the means to fine you out of existence if you are not. So that's the real part and parcel, that's the real teeth in the omnibus rule. Let's talk for just a moment about House Bill 300. And for those of ye, and the reason I say ye is to avoid a repetition of y'all, for those of you who are in Oklahoma, House Bill 300 won't really resonate with you. It does in Texas, however, and it will see a duplication in other states around the country during 2014. Illinois, for example, is considering a patient privacy law of its own. House Bill 300 in Texas actually supersedes HIPAA. And as amended by Senate Bill 1609, it presents some really interesting training challenges for covered entities around the state. The employee training that you are required to offer has to cover state and federal patient privacy law. The training has to be job-specific. In other words, it has to be appropriate to the employee's position in the practice. You have to train new employees by their 90th day on the job. That's a change now, of course, through Senate Bill 1609, amending House Bill 300. You have to offer retraining when the law changes or by the first anniversary of the change in the law. So in other words, let's say on January 2nd, something in Texas privacy law changes. that means you've got to offer retraining by January 2nd, 2015. And this is the key. At the bottom of the screen, you have to maintain signed statements attesting to training. In other words, what the state is looking for, what Brother Greg and the folks in the Attorney General's office are looking to find, are signed attestations that your employees have actually attended the training. And you have to maintain those in written form, or you have to use our learning management system, one of the two. The information that our LMS requires should be sufficient for that signed statement codicil in the law. But if you're not using our learning management system, if you're not using our House Bill 300 training module, then you need to make sure that you're maintaining copies of those signed and dated statements signed by the employee stating that they attended training on a specific date. If you are not maintaining those on a consistent basis, you need to go back and start filling in the blank spots now, because those are now required through Senate Bill 1609's amendment on House Bill 300. As I mentioned, our learning management system does keep the training records for you. Now, I'm not trying to present a commercial for the LMS, but that's one of the real responsibilities that we try to take off your hands. That process, or that little bit of our offering, is sufficient for Senate Bill 1609 requirements. The other training providers out there across the marketplace, and of course there are a couple, they will require you to have signed statements in place. They don't have an LMS mechanism that retains that training data for you. So if you avail yourself of a webinar or another training opportunity for your team, then you're going to have to keep those signed statements yourself. And they have to be kept 6 years. Their sole purpose, their only purpose, is to verify the attendance of your employees in these training events. So that's House Bill 300 as amended by Senate Bill 1609. Really, Senate Bill 1609 just backed off a couple of the time frames, but it was, for those of us who were very concerned about being compliant with House Bill 300, it was very interesting rulemaking down in Austin, Texas. Now let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about OSHA, and more particularly about the globally harmonized system and its adoption by OSHA. The globally harmonized system, as a catch-all, is a different way of presenting hazard communication information to entities across the United States, manufacturers, assembly plants, construction operations, in addition to healthcare entities. All rely on specific hazard information with respect to chemicals and other hazardous substances that come through the door or onto the job site. The problem is, all around the world, other countries rely on that same information, and it is at variance from one country to another. For example, a substance that is toxic in China might be considered harmful in the United States, or a substance that is poisonous in the United States might be considered non-toxic in Sri Lanka. So the idea behind the globally harmonized system was to bring all the countries across the globe into some degree of harmony with respect to how they classify, how they label chemical hazards. And that's the real impact of GHS. The blueprint for the globally harmonized system is the United Nations Purple Book, and it is ponderous. For those of you who have actually spent some time with the Purple Book, you know as well as I do that it's not an easy thing to flip through. You have to understand the real basics of GHS and then understand the nuances involved in the labeling system in order to really get up to speed with the globally harmonized system. But it does provide that standardized approach, and one of the things you'll see in your workplace, particularly as 2014 wears on and we get closer to 2015, you'll see those very confusing material safety data sheets that you've been collecting in those binders for years now, replaced by what GHS refers to as safety data sheets. They have just a few more than a dozen sections. They are much easier, in my view at least, to understand, and those SDSs will begin to migrate and take the place of the MSDSs in your MSDS binder. And I think you'll find, as your employees have to make access to this chemical information, that the process is made far easier by the language and the structure of the safety data sheets. That's their real contribution to a safer workplace environment. OSHA began the GHS phase-in some time ago, and of course, this bears mentioning again if you're in a dental office. If you did not train your employees on or before December the 1st, you needed to. That was a requirement in the law, and obviously now you're behind the gun, as it were. You've got to catch up to speed over the next few days, make sure that those employees receive training before the end of the year. That training has to cover these new label elements and the SDS, the Safety Data Sheet format. As I mentioned a moment ago, the new Safety Data Sheet contains a number of different sections. They are always in the same order, so the SDS format is a criticality with respect to what your folks need to understand. Manufacturers begin to use GHS labels by 2015. They have to update their workplace labeling, and of course this would apply in most dental practices by June 2016, and provide training on the new physical and health hazards as presented through GHS. So this is a real step forward for OSHA and certainly the United Nations. And I get a lot of questions from a number of our clients who are concerned about whether or not the United Nations overstepped its boundaries in adopting the globally harmonized system for the United States. We didn't, as a country, we didn't give up any sovereignty to the United Nations, in my view at least, in adopting the globally harmonized system. The one thing we did, and the thing I think that will cause the GHS adoption to be remembered with some degree of fondness in a decade or two, is that we've leveled the playing field around the world. We don't live in a society any longer where we can discount chemical threats from other countries, from other folks who don't label as we do. With GHS, of course, now that means that we're all in the same playing field, and that's a really critical aspect as we enter the new global economy and understand that we can't start and stop things at our own national borders. There's no way to close the door on things coming in from overseas. So let's talk now about the year ahead. 2014 brings a great deal of promise. It brings a great deal of opportunity for all of us, but more importantly, it brings some new focuses for OSHA. And here are on your screen 5 things that OSHA is going to be looking for over the course of the year. They're going to be making sure that your emergency exits are clear and your exit routes are marked. And I would invite you to go through your practice and take a look at those emergency exit avenues, because I can guarantee you that in about a third of the practices I've been in, those emergency exits are blocked, the routes are not defined, not illuminated, not signage posted. That's going to get you into trouble in 2014. Obviously, the hazard communication issue that we talked about a moment ago, GHS, is also something that OSHA is going to be looking for. They're going to be wanting to make sure that you provided the needed training to your team, and of course that you're beginning the process of updating your MSDS binder to those safety data sheets as the manufacturers begin to adopt them and send them out. OSHA is also going to be looking for machine guards in place, and if you have a grinder, any kind of an abrasive wheel tool in a lab or another part of your building, you need to make sure that that guard is in place and stays there. OSHA is also going to be checking for those written safety programs that we keep talking about. Their area of enforcement will focus on those in the year ahead, and there will be a cadre of new regional emphasis programs that, quite frankly, we aren't able to define yet. We're not incredibly sure that OSHA is able to define them either, but Lee Slayton can give us a little insight on the regional emphasis programs as they begin to take shape in 2014. Lee, I know you're sitting back and listening. Perhaps this is a good time for you to share with us some observations that you've made as you've toured dental practices across the state over the last several months. Why are some of these bullet points real criticalities for many dental practices?
Well, Jim, the biggest reason is these are, if you look on the inspection reports when OSHA actually comes in and does an inspection, you can just about always count on seeing these as violations. You know, I've inspected about 300 dental and medical practices in the last 2 years now, and it's like a broken record. Machine guarding, emergency exit, written safety programs. Those are 3 things that I can, you know, if I'm going to go out and jump on OSHA's database and look and see what's happened this week, if there have been medical or dental practices, I can pretty much bet my paycheck that at least one of those things is going to show up. I mean, that's top of the list. It's for an OSHA inspector going into a medical or dental practice. This is the these are no-brainers for them. It's something they always look for because too often they find it.
Can we talk a little bit about specifics, Lee? Let's go back to the emergency exits and exit routes. What is required for the typical office environment?
Well, first of all, you've got to have emergency exit signs and a map so that when folks are in there, they know how to get out. They've got some directions. So you need to have a map that should be posted. Gosh, in a dental or medical practice that maybe has 5 to 6 exam rooms or operatories, you're talking 2,000 to 4,000 square feet. You're going to want at least 5 or 6 of those maps posted in different places so that folks can get a sense on here's where I go to get out of here. And a lot of folks, I've had several staff people over the last year ask me, well, what's so important about these signs being lighted or these emergency exit signs at least being reflective so that they'll reflect light? What you've got to understand, if you've never been in an enclosed space where there's been a fire, most of the time you're going to have thick smoke, and it's going to be like the middle of the night. So number one, it's scary, and number two, it's hard to see. So that's why it's so important that you either have reflective signs or illuminated signs so that you can see how to get out of there. And of course, going hand in hand with that, and Jim, you kind of touched on it just briefly, and that's our means of egress blocked. If you got a illuminated exit sign, that's great, but if it's blocked by some old cabinets that you're getting rid of or an old piece of equipment where someone can't get to that exit, you're flirting with disaster. Because what you've got to think about, and I'm going to digress just a minute, Jim. Along with these things Jim has put up here on the list, something that goes hand in hand with the emergency exits and exit routes are actually doing fire drills. Sadly, most of the practices I've been in the last year, I'd say the great majority of them have not done a fire drill in the last year. Some of them have never done a fire drill at all. And, my coaches in college and in high school, they always said, you play like you practice. And the worst possible time to be running a fire drill is the first time you're doing it and it's for real. So you've got to have a plan, a map. You've got to have signs to show how to get out, but then you need to practice that. Because as a staff, if you haven't practiced it, not only are you responsible for getting yourself out safely, but you also have that responsibility of getting your patients out safely. They are literally putting their lives in your hands. And the first time you're exiting the building, you don't want it to be for real. You want to practice that so you know how to get out, what's the safest way to get out, and to make sure that all your patients get out safely as well.
Lee, I don't want to derail you here, but is there not a written program that's also a component of this emergency action plan?
Absolutely, yeah. Your emergency action plan is one of your written programs. Now, I'm going to talk about the letter of the law, and then I'm going to talk about the practicality of it. If you have a practice with 10 or less employees, you are not required to have a written emergency action plan. You can actually communicate that verbally with your staff. There's only one big problem with that. You can't prove to OSHA that you have a plan in place if it's not written and it's not updated regularly. It's kind of a catch-22. So, for instance, for all of our dental and medical clients, we have a written emergency action plan. And our clients do at least 2 fire drills a year so that they can go through and actually go through the process, know who's going to be in charge of what, how to make sure that everyone, including the patients, get out of there safely. So, and you know, as we're talking about written safety programs, Jim, the other piece with written safety programs is they've got to be updated on a regular basis. And this is nice as we've got the new year just around the corner. Most practices, what they'll do, a lot of folks will sit down actually at the first of the year. That's kind of a New Year's resolution thing. And they'll take a look at those plans and see what's changed, update them. Of course, our client base is a little different because we actually go in and do that for them annually. But these are things that should not be left to chance. You know, hopefully the folks out there that are listening in today will go through their whole career and not have to do an emergency evacuation for real. But do you want to take a roll of the dice on something that critical? Because if you don't do it right, you don't get a makeover on this sort of thing. You've got one chance to do it correctly, and there are other staffers and there are patients whose lives depend on how you react and do that process.
Well, there's an old saying, I think, that your survival is not inevitable, and that certainly applies to these emergency action plans and why we so wholeheartedly recommend them.
Absolutely.
The compliance aspect is frightening enough. The real dire portent is in imagining a situation in which you have to use that plan and don't have it. And that would certainly be enough to send chills up and down most people's spine. Very quickly, can we just touch on the regional emphasis programs and perhaps a little personal insight from you with respect to what you really think OSHA is going to be focusing on in the year ahead?
Jim, I would say probably for dental and medical, the two big things are going to be HAZCOM, because we've got a component change coming there, and written safety programs. They all kind of go hand in hand. If you look back over the violations in the last year, the last 2 years, the common denominator in medical and dental is a lack of up-to-date written safety programs. And of course, HAZCOM being one of those. And with GHS coming into play, they're going to be taking a much harder look at HAZCOM programs in particular in the next year to 2 years, just to make sure our folks getting with the new program and making sure that they've got that hazardous chemical inventory up to date. For the hazard communication programs, that's probably the single biggest deficiency that we find when we're doing inspections is the lack of a hazardous chemical inventory. And if I've had probably the most common question I'll have asked me or one of our inspectors is, well, why is it so important to have a hazardous chemical inventory list? We've got all our MSDS sheets. Why is that so important to have? And it basically boils down to this. If emergency personnel are called to your office, when a fire captain walks into your office, there are 2 questions, but actually 3 questions they're going to want an answer to right away, and you're going to need to know them. If you've already evacuated the building, they're gonna go out to your rally point, and they're going to ask the person in charge of the head count, is everyone out of that building? They need to know that, because if you can't give them a definitive answer, then they've got to send someone in to sweep the building and make sure everyone's out. So that's number one. Number two is we know electricity and water don't play well together. So the second thing that fire captain is going to want to know is where's the electrical breaker panel so they can de-energize all those circuits. The third thing they're going to want to know is what chemicals do you have in that office that can hurt my personnel? And that's where that hazardous chemical inventory comes in. So if you know where your MSDS book is and your written safety programs, that's where that hazardous chemical inventory is going to be, and you can point them to that so that they'll know exactly what they're dealing with. So that's
as you say, with the adoption of GHS, that becomes a natural for OSHA to point to.
Yep. Yeah, I see a much heightened awareness of that over the next 2 to 3 years, simply because, number one, it's introducing change, and number two, it is critical for emergency personnel if they ever have to go into your place of business that they know what you have in there that can hurt them.
Okay. Terrific. Lee Slayton, thanks very much, and more than anything else, we certainly appreciate your insight and your experience with respect to those actual on-site facility inspections. You can't, I know you can't do too many of those, but you see the same things cropping up again and again, so that information for us is invaluable.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much, Lee. We'll look forward to talking with you again in 2014. One of the other real questions as we look toward next year is what will the Office of the Inspector General and KPMG, one of the big four auditors, look for with respect to HIPAA compliance? This is a challenging subject, not just because there are so many unknowns at the moment, but because there are so many ways in which you can get tripped up with a failure to remain compliant. First, there's a compliance notebook. This is what the Office of the Inspector General, if they ever actually conduct an audit of your practice, will be looking for. That compliance notebook has the authorization forms required, and there are about a dozen all told. The authorization forms or denial of authorization forms, all of those should be in that compliance notebook. You also need to make sure that you've got an up-to-date notice of privacy practices in your practice, so that's got to be current. The processes have to be in place, and your employees have to understand what they're required to do, the steps they need to take if they're asked to produce a patient authorization or a patient wants to decline an authorization, etc. All of those processes have to be in place, along with an IT security risk analysis and contingency plans. And if you look back at the audits that KPMG conducted across the country during 2012, they will tell us that this risk analysis, this understanding of the vulnerabilities within your information technology system, this risk analysis is the Achilles heel for most practices around the country. If you don't have the risk analysis, if you haven't come up with a contingency plan to ensure that you've got a clean data backup, then obviously that fourth bullet point is going to resonate and resonate loudly within your practice. Incidentally, when Hurricane Sandy hit Manhattan, 50,000 covered entities at risk, less than 10% had those contingency plans in place. So they are required for a reason. If you don't have them, you're literally rolling the dice every day, hoping that there's not some natural disaster that will require you to maintain a backup of your patient health information. Finally, down at the bottom of the page, you see staff HIPAA training and good faith efforts. The good faith efforts portion of this sentence is your last remaining get-out-of-jail-free card with respect to HIPAA compliance. If KPMG came in and audited you during 2014, and there's certainly no guarantee that they're going to continue to do that, but I think the risk is certainly very high that practices will continue to be audited over the next several years and in increasing numbers. Let's assume that they walk through your door tomorrow. What they are looking for at the moment is an indication that you're actually doing something about patient privacy, rather than saying, as a great many people say to me on a daily basis, oh, we don't pay attention to all that HIPAA stuff. the good faith efforts are the only remediating factor that you may have with respect to these compliance issues. And if you can't demonstrate that you're making active progress toward becoming compliant, then KPMG or whoever picks up the audit baton in 2014 has every reason to expect that you have no intention of being compliant, and they will fine you accordingly. So that's just a word to the wise on what we'll be looking for over the next year with OIG and KPMG in play, or whoever picks up the audit baton with these HIPAA and high-tech audits. Keep in mind that KPMG gave us a fair bit of knowledge with respect to the 150 practices that they audited. They discovered that 30%, in other words, almost 50 practices of the 150 that they audited during 2012 were unaware of specific patient privacy requirements. What they saw across the board was a lack of application of sufficient resources toward compliance issues. In other words, the practice didn't have a privacy officer, or there wasn't training available, training wasn't provided, there wasn't any attention paid. This incomplete implementation that you see as the third bullet point means that you've taken some information away from these webinars, but you really haven't done anything about it. What we saw in about 30% of the practices that KPMG audited was a complete disregard for patient privacy issues, and consequently what KPMG has done, it's created an audit trail so that the government can now go to your business associates, the people with whom you should have these business associate agreements, and actually target you through the business associates' lack of compliance. So KPMG has put the audit structure in place, and they've created that very tempting back door for whomever does the audits in 2014 and beyond to go to your business associates, pick them apart, and land on your doorstep as a result. That would be very frightening if you didn't have those business associate agreements in place. As Larry pointed out when we started the webinar, we've done a number of webinars on BAs and BAAs. If you need more information, I'll give you my email address and we can find some time to chat. But obviously what we're going to see targeted over 2014 are the business associates, because they will lead through the back door directly to covered entities like your practice. That's the audit trail as we see it now for 2014 and beyond. There are, of course, some ways in which Smart Training can help. We offer specific staff training on GHS, on HIPAA and high-tech, and on House Bill 300. Our new Privacy Officer training module eliminates the need to bring your privacy officer up to speed. The one thing I see again and again in practices is, oh yes, they've appointed a young lady or a young gentleman sitting out here as the privacy officer, but that individual has no idea what they're supposed to be doing in that job function. Our Privacy Officer training module brings that individual up to speed and does it in an afternoon, and it also provides the templates that are likely going to be needed in your practice to ensure compliance over the course of the next year. We can also, through Lee Slayton and his crew, inspect for OSHA compliance. We offer staff-level OSHA-compliant training on all those OSHA-related topics that we were talking about, and we can help you develop written programs, policies, and procedures that you'll need to have in place over the year ahead. Now, I want to take just a moment and give you my email address, and you will need a pen and paper to write it down. You're not going to see it appear on the screen, but I'm going to give you my email address because I know if you have any questions, any concerns after you've spent the time in the webinar, you'll want to get those addressed, and I will do my best to respond to you within 24 hours, 48 hours, perhaps during the holiday season. But feel free to drop me a line. If I can't answer your question, I'll refer it to Lee Slayton or someone who can. Here it is. It's Jim, J-I-M, Moore, M-O-O-R-E, no period in between, just Jim Moore at smarttrainingllc.com. Jim Moore at smarttrainingllc.com. And again, feel free to send me an email, and I will be more than happy to make sure that whomever has the appropriate answers gets back to you in a timely fashion, because we know your questions, your comments, your concerns are our concerns. They are important to us, and we're certainly going to make good on that commitment as we move through 2014 to be at your call, because our service is one that we know you depend on, and you're going to have an increasing measure over the course of the next year. That just about wraps it from the Smart Training corner of the world. For Larry Lewis and Lee Slayton and all of us at the Smart Training staff, we want to wish you and your staff the best of holiday seasons, and we look forward to having a chance to interact with you again in the year ahead.